I think, a very exciting point in our program because philanthropy has become so deeply ingrained within the American experience that it truly does serve as all things to all people. The humblest gift of loose change to a hungry person and the president's use of the bully pulpit to rally the nation to give, each of these decisions alike is an example of philanthropy. But while all forms of philanthropy are intrinsically generous, not all are created equal in our eyes. We tend to place more value on the selfless gift rather than the self-serving gift. We tend to place more value on the poor person's small gift than on the rich person's large one, on the grounds that for the poor person it's a greater sacrifice. And the question of the best and highest use of philanthropy is really a difficult one. Is it better to solve existing problems or to try to prevent new problems from starting? Is it better to do a whole lot of good for a few people or to do a little bit of good for many, many people? Well, today we have two very distinguished philanthropists who will grapple with the question of philanthropy's best and highest use through the prism of their own deeply informed beliefs and moral philosophies. Given their backgrounds, not to mention the subject matter today, I'm sure that presidential examples will figure in the debate. Each will make an opening statement, each will then answer questions posed by the moderator, and we will finish up. You'll have a chance to question them about their approaches and their ideals as we all try to define how to make the most of this precious American tradition of generosity. And what I'm going to do now is introduce each of our panelists, and back to back, then they will come up to speak. Because once they start speaking, I don't want to break up the flow of it by another introduction. We'll start with the first guest, William Schambra. William almost graduated from the Wright University in Michigan. He graduated from Michigan State. He was so close to Grand Valley and yet so far. Bill is the director of the Hudson Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal, as well as a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, based in Washington. I'm going to have more to say about Bill's work at the Bradley Center in a moment, but first I'd like to share some highlights of his very distinguished career in both government and the realm of philanthropy. Bill was appointed to the National Historical Publications and Records Commission by President Ronald Reagan, where he served from 1984 to 1990. He also served the Reagan administration as senior advisor and chief speechwriter for Attorney General Edwin Meese III. Other government postings included service under the Director of Office and Personnel Management, Constance Horner, and Secretary of Health and Human Services, Louis Sullivan. On the nonprofit side of the ledger, Bill directed social policy programs for the American Enterprise Institute, served as co-director of AEI's A Decade of Study of the Constitution. In 1992, he joined the staff of the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee, where he served as director of programs. After 11 years as a grant maker, Bill joined the Hudson Institute. If you subscribe to the Chronicle of Philanthropy, you will recognize Bill's name from his numerous op-eds and letters to the editor. He has also written extensively on the Constitution, the theory and practice of civic revitalization, and civil society in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, Policy Review, Christian Science Monitor, Nonprofit Quarterly. And he's also edited several volumes, including As Far as Republican Principles Will Admit, the collected essays of Martin Diamond. But now I want to come back to Bill's work at the Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. For some years now, Bill has run what I think is an irreplaceable institution in the field of philanthropy. It's the only place I know of where people of very different ideological backgrounds are invited to debate the pressing issues of the day. It is, I think, it's just an irreplaceable asset in our field. Bill runs these forums, sometimes gets criticism from the left for some of the subjects titled, sometimes criticism from the right, but these are forums that really bring out the key issues of the day. And unlike many denizens of the East Coast who feel that all of the wisdom in the country is pretty much concentrated within 15 miles of the eastern seaboard, Bill brings people from all over the country. And just from the Johnson Center alone, he's brought me, my colleague Robert Shallett, Terry Behrens, who runs the Foundation Review. So this is the place to go when you want to talk serious issues in philanthropy. And I'll close my introduction to Bill by noting that he has also served as a board member of the Corporation for National and Community Service. Bill will be our proponent of a conservative viewpoint on American philanthropy. Our other panelist, Harris Wofford. Almost an infinite number of ways in which you could introduce Harris. You might say he's a card-carrying member of America's greatest generation, having served in the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II. You might mention that he was a friend and an advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King. You could certainly say that it was Harris who introduced President Obama in Philadelphia at the National Constitution Center before the president's speech on race in America, a more perfect union. But my preference is to note that there aren't too many people in American history who have single-handedly changed the course of a presidential election. But Harris Wofford is one of them. Take you back now to 1960, one of the closest elections in the history of our nation. And shortly before the election, Dr. Martin Luther King is arrested in Georgia on trumped-up charges and thrown into a rural jail that was a very grim set of conditions. Many people feared for his life in this gulag-like lockup, including his wife, of course, Coretta Scott King, who was then pregnant for their third child. It was imperative that the presidential candidate John F. Kennedy do something, or he would lose his credentials as a civil rights candidate. But there was great fear that if he did anything, the Southern segregationists, who were very powerful in the Democratic Party, men like Senator James Eastland, would bolt the party. And it was Harris who came up with the answer. He persuaded Sergeant Shriver, President Kennedy's brother-in-law, that the candidate must call Mrs. King and offer his support and his sympathy. Shriver shrewdly waited till the other advisors who would have opposed that call left the room, convinced the candidate. Then candidate Kennedy called Mrs. King. And after that call, Reverend King's father, who was also a minister, came out very strongly for Kennedy, and it was the African-American vote that provided the narrow margin of victory in a number of key states, and most scholars agree, swung the election Kennedy's way. If you want to read the full story, that was a very, very condensed version of that story. I would urge you to read Harris's book of Kennedys and Kings, Making Sense of the 60s. But remember, it's only the start of the introduction of Harris. In 1961, President Kennedy appointed Harris special assistant to the president on civil rights, which made him point man for desegregation and voting rights struggles across the South. He was instrumental in the formation of the Peace Corps and served as its associate director from '62 to '66. The academic world then beckoned, and Harris was named president of the State University of New York at Old Westbury in 1966, followed by the presidency at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania from '70 to '78. And then he continued to disprove F. Scott Fitzgerald's assertion that there are no second acts in American life. He returned to the political arena, serving as Pennsylvania's Secretary of Labor and Industry from '87 to '91. In 1991, Pennsylvania's senior U.S. Senator John Hines died tragically in an aviation accident, and Harris was appointed by Governor Bob Casey to fill the seat. A special election was held late in 1991, in which Harris prevailed over former Pennsylvania Governor and U.S. Attorney General Dick Thornburgh. He lost narrowly his bid for re-election during the Republican Revolution year of 1994, but President Bill Clinton then appointed Harris in '95 to be the CEO of the Corporation for National and Community Service, which many in Congress were attempting to abolish at that time. During his 6 years at the helm, Harris was able to preserve the corporation, expand its operations, and win it bipartisan support. Since his retirement in 2001, Harris has won the John W. Gardner Leadership Award and continued to advance his life's work of citizen service by serving on the boards of organizations such as America's Promise, Youth Service America, and the Points of Light Foundation. Harris today will be our proponent for a liberal viewpoint of American philanthropy. And so, I give you our first speaker, opening statement, Bill Schambra.
Thank you, Joel, for that wonderful introduction, and especially for the comments about the Bradley Center's programs, the panels in Washington. As you pointed out, I tend to get criticized from both the left and the right for some of those programs, so I'm grateful that someone notices that we're trying to bring those two extremes together. It's always a pleasure to be back in Michigan, where I grew up, not too far from here, in the city of Midland. As you can imagine, my father worked for Dow Chemical Company. When I was a young person, I spent a lot of time, as much time as I could, on the trout streams of Michigan, where in the remotest reaches, where it didn't look like anyone had ever walked the stream for years and years, you would come across wing dams and other structures that had been built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, many years before. I understand from the autobiography of Mr. Hauenstein, for whom this center is named, that he was the director of some of the crews that built those wing dams and other structures in Manistee National Forest. Some of the structures I was grateful for. The platforms that were built over the prime trout holes, I was not so grateful for. They were obviously friendlier to the trout than the trout fishermen. And it's always a pleasure to see Dottie Johnson. The last time I saw Dottie, I think, was whom I got to know a bit on the board of the Corporation for National and Community Service. The last time I saw Dottie, I think she had just heard me make a presentation at the Council on Foundations, and she sort of planted herself in front of me in that way she has and said, "You just like to make trouble, don't you?" And I don't know if I like to, but that's my assignment today, so here comes trouble. It's no secret that the major American foundations today are madly in love with the Obama administration. They're willing and eager to do whatever they can to make it a success, willing and eager to join hands with it in collaborative venture, no matter pesky little annoyances like the boundary between the public and private sectors. We knew this was coming when, shortly before the election of 2008, the Chronicle of Philanthropy did a survey of campaign contributions by foundation executives and found that 98% 98% of those campaign contributions from foundation executives went to the Obama administration. Whenever I say that to foundation people, they always say, "Oh, what was wrong with the 2%? I mean, what? No wonder then that foundations blessed with a president whose early career they themselves funded have avidly sought administration funding to replicate and expand their favorite demonstration programs, and have lined up to support matching funds for federal programs like the Social Innovation Fund. Nowhere was this enthusiasm more apparent than in the recent announcement by the foundation affinity group Grantmakers in Health. That is a group of foundations, all of whom have a common interest in funding public health matters. The announcement by this group that it intended to do all it could to ensure the success of Obamacare, the recently passed federal reform of the American healthcare system. In its report entitled Implementing Healthcare Reform, the group suggests that skepticism about the new law could surely only be based on ignorance or confusion. So foundations, they go on, should make every effort to enlighten the public about its puzzlingly elusive benefits. In a blog entry at Huffington Post introducing the report, Jane Wales of the Aspen Institute noted that, quote, working to generate and sustain public support over the next few years will be critical if the law is to withstand efforts to repeal or undermine it. By helping to ensure its successful implementation, she continues, we could even, as she puts it, restore public trust in government and demonstrate government's positive role in improving lives. Wouldn't that be something? She cheerily concludes. Well, it would indeed be something, but probably not the manifest public good suggested by her enthusiasm. It would rather be overt support for the transparently ideological proposition that government naturally deserves to be trusted and expanded through measures like Obamacare. Who, Ms. seems to suggest, could be unhappy with the bright and sunny prospect of government fully entrusted and aggressively enlarged? Well, if public opinion surveys are any indication, that would be the vast majority of the American people, which may soon turn into a majority of the members of the U.S. House of Representatives. Throughout this report's pleasant, innocuous, seemingly nonpartisan chatter about ways to educate the public about the wonders of Obamacare, we catch only glimpses of the overriding political fact that the measure remains bitterly divisive and controversial. Indeed, it is so controversial that after November, grant makers heeding the report might well find themselves locked in savage partisan combat with a Republican congressional majority bent on repealing Obamacare. Most assuredly, at that point, some newly elected Tea Party legislator will tumble off the turnip truck and say something like this: hey, I thought American philanthropy was supposed to fund charitable activities, not PR campaigns for big government. How come we're giving foundations all these charitable tax deductions if all they're trying to do is to replace charity with government money? We better hold this one of them congressional hearings. Something like this happened after President Reagan took office. Something like it happened after Newt Gingrich came to power, and it will surely happen again. Then we will witness, once again, a great exasperated explosion of ridicule and alarm from foundation land. Its leaders will profess deep shock at the suggestion that they're somehow partisan, and they will remind us that only the most unsophisticated neo-Tocquevillian rube could possibly believe that charitable organizations are about doing charity, rather than pressing for what they proudly describe as systemic social change in the face of America's vast and grave structural injustices. But this almost inevitable scenario should remind us that the large American foundations are forever either naively or willfully blind to the partisan implications of the measures that they pursue. As in the case of Obamacare, they tend to believe that certain public measures are so patently and objectively in the public interest, so obviously in accord with the facts, as documented by the professionals and the experts, that only untutored ignorance or partisan obstreperousness could explain opposition to them. This is a reflection of the century-old link between the large American foundations and the ideology of progressivism. Indeed, foundations and progressivism sprang up about the same time and nurtured each other's growth. The essence of American progressivism is the conviction that public affairs are better managed by professional experts rather than amateur citizens. After all, experts are trained in the objective sciences of society like sociology and psychology, which allow them to analyze and control the social forces that give us so much difficulty. Ordinary citizens, of course, are not so trained, and so they tend to bring to public affairs only their narrow, unenlightened, parochial points of view, which make a hash of public policy. No wonder, then, that the major foundations have always backed the expansion of professional expertise. Early on, they supported research universities and think tanks, the development of the social sciences, and the modernization of the legal and medical professions. Today, progressivism is nicely captured in philanthropy's relentless emphasis on conceptualizing and analyzing social interventions in terms so abstract as to be inscrutable to any but the credentialed elites. Support for centralizing, rationalizing, and professionalizing the American healthcare system, therefore, is hardly a departure for American foundations, but rather simply another reflection of their long-term debt to progressivism. The perpetual problem with progressivism, as it is with established American philanthropy, is that this devotion to professionalism and expertise tends to manifest itself to everyday citizens as detachment, aloofness, and arrogance. How could it be otherwise with all the condescending and insulting lectures that opposition to the reach of expertise can only be based on ignorance or prejudice or parochialism? No wonder then that today we are witnessing a great populist insurgency against the experts, which may be as much about patronizing tone as offensive substance. I would suggest that instead of simply ridiculing that new legislator who will soon raise questions about the charitable nature of foundations, it might be wise instead to ask ourselves if there isn't an element of wisdom in what he or she will say. Philanthropy has funded many studies detailing the deplorable decline in American civic engagement and political participation. Yet it's been reluctant to reflect on its own contribution to that decline through its persistent denigration of everyday citizenly common sense in favor of professional expertise. What if foundations were to put aside their bias toward rationalization and centralization and instead make a determined effort to seek out and support charitable projects designed by everyday citizens? What if they were to stop drawing up social engineering schemes back at foundation headquarters to parachute into distressed neighborhoods and instead seek out the quiet, diligent, effective community efforts already underway to solve their own problems with their own resources? Perhaps that would help channel today's populist enthusiasms into local grassroots initiatives aimed at solving immediate problems. After all, if the Tea Party folks don't want government to expand government programs, then it's incumbent upon them to tackle social problems themselves through voluntary civic associations. Foundations would do well to encourage this productive deployment of newly abundant civic energies. Now, foundation leaders will heave a great weary sigh at this suggestion. They will maintain that it would be nothing more than a return to mere charity, a messy, cluttered, incoherent approach to social problems, reflecting untutored popular prejudices rather than the smoothly humming, coherent, rational designs so carefully calibrated by the experts. But it's also possible to describe this as a grand renewal of American democracy. It would signal a renewal of faith not in government, but in the capacity of everyday citizens to solve their own problems in their own communities according to their own particular moral and religious commitments. Beneath all its messiness and incoherence and particularity, we would discover again the rejuvenated spirit of American freedom and self-government. That truly would be something.
Welcome. May I first pay attention to the students who marched in here, to my delight, among many other delights that I have, including being on this panel with Joel and Bill, and being at this great place on its 50th anniversary year, where last night I read in the Grand Valley Lantern that President Haas and the head of the Student Senate have issued the 50-hour service challenge as the way to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Grand Valley State University. 50 hours of community service to be registered, and they called on all students to do it, and faculty and staff. It's now a large university, and there are large resources involved in that for the whole community in this area. So I salute them, and I want to say to the students that it was, by the way, you look young enough to be high school students, right? Or to be a high school student again. Or to be a young man like Bill Schambra and Joel again for 4 years. And I hope you all know what a score is, do you? Right. It's amazing. I've taken a little poll. The proportion of the people who no longer have an idea of what, they may know that Lincoln said 7 years ago, but I've asked this now in a lot of places. They don't know what a score is. Now, students responding to President Kennedy in creating the Peace Corps. This is the 50th anniversary of the Peace Corps. And on the steps of the Student Union at the University of Michigan, Kennedy arrived at almost 2 a.m. In late October in the 1960 election after debating Nixon on television earlier that night. 10,000 people, most of them students, faculty, and townspeople were waiting. They had been waiting 2 hours on a cold October night. The staff went to bed, the press went to bed, the story was the debate. He had no prepared remarks, and in the tape of what he said that will be replayed a lot on the Big Ten television network documentary, he asked, how many of you are willing to go and spend years of your life in Ghana, Africa? How many would join the Foreign Service and dedicate decades of your life to service overseas? How many? He asked about 6 questions. It didn't say a Peace Corps, it didn't say a volunteer program. He put those questions, he got great applause, and the next day a student group called Michigan Students for World Responsibility took petitions around to Senator Kennedy to say, form your volunteer program and we will go, we want to go. And they called, the mother of a student called me in Washington. She was part of our civil rights campaign section and said, my daughters, they've now collected 1,000 signatures, and can you arrange so that they can present it to Senator Kennedy? And I passed the idea on to the campaign. They set up a date. But when they told Kennedy that students had responded that way, he said, we ought to really make a major proposal on this. In 10 days, the staff put together a proposal. I had nothing to do with it. Sergeant Schreiber later held it. We were doing other things in the campaign. And at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, he made the Peace Corps proposal. But Sergeant Schreiber and President Kennedy would say that if it had not been for those students that night, there's no reason to think there would have been a Peace Corps with all the other urgencies. So remember what you can do. Now, you had a generously long, you might say, introduction of my trajectory as if it was full of successes, except you're the first person who's ever introduced me that said that I wasn't in the Senate any longer because I got defeated in an election. I've run for office 3 times. Once in 9th grade, and I was defeated. Once with an upset victory against the Attorney General of the United States. That was fun. Then Rick Santorum, who used to be a household word, and maybe again, defeated me. And a counter resume of our failures would be just as interesting, probably more interesting than successes. And Bill Schambra talked about some potential failures of some experimentation in public-private partnerships that are going on. And I think his words of warning are always important. One of his values to the public-private partnership of the Corporation for National Service, which he served on, and the great embodiment of public-private partnerships. She's a one-person public-private partnership. Dottie Johnson is somewhere here. Dottie, there. She and Michigan Council on Foundations, on nonprofit organizations, on the State Michigan Service Commission that determines where AmeriCorps members go, has played a tremendous role in building this public-private venture called the Corporation for National Service. And the one great bipartisan achievement of this last, how many 100 days, a year plus of this administration was the Kennedy Hatch, the great Republican, the McCain-Obama prime co-sponsors, Serve America Act, would take the domestic Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, to grow from 75,000 members. And when I left as CEO, it was 50,000. And President Bush II saw to Congress, shepherded Congress ultimately to expand it to 75,000 in his term. It now has been authorized by overwhelming votes in both Senate and House, with Republican ranking members of every committee helping to craft the bill for the first time, and Dottie knows what hard times we had before. For the first time, there was such bipartisan support, fueled in part by sentiment about Ted Kennedy dying. It was his last bill, his last appearance on the floor. But the bill had been crafted over time. President Obama had asked for it to be put on a fast track. At the end of it, for the first time while I was in the Senate or later, there was the whole chamber, even those who voted against it, stood in applause. And many conservative Senator Enzi got up and said, this is the most genuine bipartisan achievement at every level. And Congress, Senate and House working together, and all of them working together in the White House that I've ever seen. Now, the structure of this national service invitation to the imagination now, in trying in the next years to move from 75,000 to 250,000, the bill authorizes, is an invitation to the nonprofit sector to create programs that help solve our most urgent problems. And the structure that was set up, a great champion and former Peace Corps volunteer, Republican Congressman Chris Shays said, is a Republican structure, by which he meant it is truly devolution of government money and power to support and expand the private, the non-profit world with new resources. 2/3 of AmeriCorps positions are decided by governor-appointed bipartisan commissions, such as the Michigan Service Commission, and then That's the first evolution. Then they hold merit selection competition. They choose local nonprofits or statewide nonprofits, and then there's a whole capacity for national ones. But 2/3 go through these state commissions, who do the selecting of the members and the administration of the programs. And so I hope by the time you're finishing high school, or very possibly after college, you will have many more opportunities to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country in terms of full-time service for a period in your life when you can serve the common good intensely and have a tremendous leadership building experience. Now, there are sharp differences at large in this country today, more, as you use, I think, words like bitterness and rage. And by the way, if the foundations with executives with whom you're arguing, I'm going to be interested in following that argument. I'm not going to spend my time defending those misbegotten foundation executives that supported Obama. I didn't know we did that well. But they and this room, all of us here together, I really truly believe, and I believe the great majority of the American people, if you put them down on a problem in a thoughtful occasion, their compass will point to what do we do about the common good. I know that's true of Bill. I know it partly by seeing him in action. Now, I have a conflict of interest because he reminded me today that his Bradley Foundation funded something that I was involved with. I didn't get any money at all as part of going almost bankrupt like Jefferson, but including campaign for Obama. But he helped fund a working group on the faith-based initiative, which is part of the largest public-private partnership in our history. And that is the partnership between government at all levels, including the federal government, and faith-based organizations who carry the load for a great deal of the service, social service, anti-poverty work, education in this country. Most Democrats, when President Bush II launched his faith-based initiative, instantly seemed to, political Democrats seemed to respond automatically against it, separation of church and state. I was one of those who instantly said, this is a great idea. It's existed for a long time in all sorts of dimensions. Catholic Charities has had billions of dollars of federal money on extraordinary service programs. They know how to get it, they're powerful, they skillful. Lutheran Services, the same thing. VISTA, the Domestic Peace Corps that Sergeant Shriver in the War on Poverty started, has always had many, many VISTAs serving in service programs that nuns are running, that faith-based organizations are running, but smaller congregations without that kind of power have not had their resources strengthened. VISTA and AmeriCorps have helped many of those faith-based organizations carry on, expand their work. For example, Habitat for Humanity, President Carter's favorite charity, Newt Gingrich's favorite charity, first said, no, we don't want any government money when AmeriCorps began. And the board finally said, we've seen it in action, said, we really want you to get it. So in my day, we went to about 700 AmeriCorps members. We didn't give it to them. They went to the national offices around service offices and got vistas. They went and applied for a national national program and got some of those. And state by state they got programs. And Gingrich, who had called AmeriCorps members federal bureaucrats in t-shirts, even though Congress specifically says they're not federal employees. And he asked Congress, every member, to help form a unit in their congressional district and expand Habitat or start a new one. And he went down to build 2 houses with Republicans and Democrats. And they invited me the Habitat invited me to go along. He had to hear the head of Habitat founder give the prayer thanking for the AmeriCorps members that enabled them to expand so much and to do what was being done in Washington slums. Newt got up on the scaffolding and did some nailing where the AmeriCorps members who had organized the site, played a major role in recruiting the members who had managed the site, were telling him where to put the nail. And I said, how'd you like your federal bureaucrats in t-shirts? And he said, I loved it. I'd like to see you and do a little rethinking. Santorum, who beat me and ridiculed AmeriCorps because he saw in action AmeriCorps members organize middle school students to be young heroes and do 13 Saturdays of service and all kinds of other things. He saw them sworn in with their family and faculty, and he turned around and became a champion. And it was Rick Santorum who beat me that encouraged us to form this working group on how you really do faith-based initiative in helping faith-based organizations to expand their service. I urge you, I'm talking to the students still again, but there's some of us older that can still respond to this point, to do your best in this conversation, this center, which has taken up this issue of philanthropy and the presidency or the presidents. You can say different things. I only want to say there's obviously a third part of this partnership that we're talking about. It's and Joel made it clear how much of it was there, and his great Kellogg Foundation came out of the other great sector, which is the profit sector. The non-profit sector, I guess, are what really is meant by the private sector. And the three-way partnership is what is going to be needed to do the expansive work that's needed to solve some of our most important problems. Now, by the way, on Habitat, let me just give you another example. They dream of having 2 trained AmeriCorps members go to the 2/3 of their units who have no paid staff and produce a house every year or so, but could be jump-started if they had 2 trained such resources go. My time is up, but I'll say it's very fitting that this is on Constitution Day. This is the date of the Constitution signing 223 years ago, is it? Now, I don't know if you love the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, or some before your age, I'd gotten brainwashed by the great memorials to Jefferson and Lincoln and Washington, and when we moved from East Tennessee up to New York, the main thing I wanted were the presidents of those presidents, my pictures of them that I had on the wall. And it went so far when I got married at age 23 just, and was talking to some men afterwards who were saying, it's really important we don't forget our wives' birthdays. It's hard to remember, but there's hell to pay if you forget your wife's birthday. And I proudly said, well, I never forget my wife's birthday. It's easy to remember because it's on Constitution Day. And my wife heard me say that, and for years she would come back to think, who in this whole country would say he remembers his wife's birthday because it's on Constitution Day? So I commend the Constitution to you. And this center should note what was implicit in what Joel said, that government, you could say, began as an absolute necessity on the Mayflower, which before they got off the Mayflower, they signed the compact that created a one civil body politic to govern their little colony. So philanthropy was an absolute necessity to make things work, and so is government. Government, these profit-making trading companies that supported the colonists, the Puritans and others. I think the Puritans were on the trading company boats, but most of the support of the colonization of America, we're the colony of mankind, Wilson liked to say, came from private profit-making corporations whose service of the common good, which is how they got a corporate charter, was to help create it, but they were to get profits. Similarly, the East India Company created the Empire of India about the same time. So from the beginning, there's been a partnership between what we're calling philanthropy and the for-profit world and the public world. Now the Constitution, you'll read it, and it will say that the Constitution will say things about almost everything important, except there's no word in it, no reference in it to this other whole structure, which is so vital, has been from the very beginning, and is now even more so, the private sector, both philanthropy and the profit world. No mention in the Constitution, but that's the Constitution with a capital C. But the low C, lowercase Constitution, what really governs our society, is in itself, from the beginning, has been a public-private partnership. So the problem for us is to argue not bitterly, but to argue passionately and strongly for what makes that partnership work at all levels. I agree with all kinds of anti-bureaucratic desires and principles of Bill Schambra. He's written some wonderful stuff about it. It's a vital message that the large foundations and large bureaucracies need to hear. But the Constitution is the great thing. And to see both sides, the capital C Constitution and the real Constitution, and make it work, you're going to have a good time working at it. It's called the public happiness, which Adams and Jefferson, before they died, agreed that they didn't like the 4th of July celebrations because it was all celebrating personal happiness on picnics and fireworks. What we want to celebrate is the public happiness of governing ourselves. And I wish you much public and personal happiness.
Well, thank you. Is this on? Okay, very good. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Harris. As you can see, two very principled and passionate people can look at philanthropy in very different ways and come to some very different conclusions. What I would like to do now, in our remaining time, is to toss a couple of questions at our debaters to get some conversation started. But I want you, in the best spirit of the playground, to pile on. The minute you see any sort of weakness, to just jump on them and hammer at them. So
That's what drove me out of teaching.
You're doing it all the time.
Bill, I'd like to direct the first question to you. I think you showed extraordinary courage in coming into an institution that spends most of its time training people and providing them, presumably, with expertise, and making such a strong statement about the lack of value of expertise. And I'd like you to expand a bit on that. You say expertise like it's a bad thing. Should Apple fire Steve Jobs because he seems to be something of an expert? high-tech? Elucidate, please.
Yeah. And pile on. No. It's professionalism, expertise is all, of course, it would ill behoove me, who spent a lot of my time trying to acquire the above, it would ill behoove me to simply trash it. But the point is that expertise and professionalism tends to understand itself in a very exclusive way. It tends to approach public problems as if it knows best. That's always been the problem with what I've broadly described as progressive politics. And it's nowhere more apparent than today, as I say. So much of the animus of the Tea Party movement, I think, comes from a kind of rejection, finally, by the American people of this notion that the experts know best. You know, the financial experts, it's not Steve Jobs who got us into trouble, it's all those wizards on Wall Street. It's all those incredibly complicated mathematical formulas that the financial wizards came up with that guaranteed earnings no matter what happened. All you had to do was plug in the variables and it would spin out prosperity forever. Well, the experts were all wrong about that. And the American people have now been witnessing this continuing self-aggrandizement by the experts. You know, when the bailouts come, they bail out the experts. They bail out the people in charge, not the everyday people who are immediately suffering the results of that kind of disastrous misapplication of expertise. So I think that's what I'm talking about. That for anyone, and Joel, you know this as well as anyone. People, grantees, potential grantees, come into foundations, are often full of wisdom about the needs of their local neighborhood. They know, because they grew up there, because they've been active there for years, they know what this neighborhood needs, right? This is that neighborhood tradition you described in your keynote address is still very much alive and well. Where is Black River High School? Holland. Holland is a great example of a town that grew up with a huge, ethnic solidarity. Look after their own. They take care of their own. Grand Rapids is an example of that. Local folks know what their own needs are, and that goes right down to the neighborhood and local community levels. Foundations need to listen to them. That's primarily my point. And yet so much of what is being taught in foundation, in schools of philanthropic expertise, is how to design programs that will transform these ill-functioning neighborhoods. Because I have been to college, I have a degree in sociology, I have a degree in social welfare, so I know what's best for people. That's the whole point of being a professional. But that, I think, is not a good attitude.
Any reactions from the assembled multitudes? Yes.
Mr. Schambra, welcome back to Michigan. My name is Jim McKay. I'm the Chief of Staff of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And I don't necessarily have a question for you, but I do have an invitation.
Yeah.
And sometime when you return home, I would love to spend a day or two with you and have you learn more about the Kellogg Foundation, a foundation that was founded by a man whose principles were not helping people, but helping people help themselves. One of our core values today. Another core value, believing that all people have the inherent capacity to affect meaningful change in their lives and in their communities. And when you visit the Kellogg Foundation, we're not going to visit our headquarters on 1 Michigan Avenue East in Battle Creek. We're going to visit the work that we're doing in 4 neighborhoods here in Grand Rapids, where we have program staff who really live by the philosophy of, the application of knowledge to the common people, sharing some best practices, and then really empowering and working with residents in those neighborhoods who are struggling with poverty day in and day out, to really identify what are the best ways and strategies for them to address these issues. Or join us in Detroit, where we're working in neighborhoods as well as in Battle Creek. I think when you're back home in Midland, I'm a great admirer of the Towson Foundation, the Dow Foundation. I'm an even greater admirer of the Midland Community Foundation, a foundation which is one of over 80 in the state of Michigan, with the Kellogg Foundation in partnership today thousands of young people, 20 years ago, who are now young adults. We're introducing them to philanthropy, giving them a meaningful role in their communities, to start addressing those issues in their local communities. So I appreciate your comments, but we do have to dance with who's in the gym. And if I look at the priorities of the Kellogg Foundation, I'm going to make sure we have healthy kids, educated kids, and secure families. We do have to be thinking beyond the Obama administration, because that's only going to be here for 4 or 8 years. We're going to take a long-term approach, and if there's alignment, we need to make sure that we can look at where we can be supportive of that, particularly looking at the need for creating systemic change, which we know is going to require public policy. So I appreciate your comments, but we invite you to spend a couple days with us at the Kellogg Foundation.
It's great, and I'd love to talk to you because I've been trying to reach the president of the Kellogg Foundation to invite him to come to Washington. I'd love to have a panel on the Kellogg Foundation's structural racism initiative, which is, as he himself would admit, a pretty controversial approach. The structural rate, it's a $20 million initiative, if I understand it correctly. Is that what
Well, overall, we're going to get $75 million.
$75 million. And we'll characterize it different ways, but the president of the Kellogg Foundation has said that part of the problem in America is that it perpetuates white supremacy, and I've heard him say it in a panel, and the structural racism approach is designed to challenge what are understood to be the inherent institutional and structural built-in inequalities in American society that perpetuate racial inequality, and to challenge those structural inequalities in a fundamental way. This is much more than racial harmony on an individual level. This is a suggestion that American society is deeply structured and fundamentally structured to perpetuate racial inequality. And and I'm quite serious about this. I mean, obviously I have reservations about it. I've written about it in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, but I think it's a terrific conversation to have. And I deeply admire the Kellogg Foundation for being willing to fund explicitly that project. An awful lot of foundations will sort of tiptoe around the edge of that, but they won't actually name it. And Kellogg has done it, and I think that's terrific. Now let's have that conversation about structural racism. Help me to get your president to Washington to have that conversation, please.
I'll be speaking with Sterling this afternoon.
Great.
Terrific. Harris, did you have a response?
Unfortunately, I missed it most until the microphone came. I needed that Benjamin Franklin invention. Professor Gutterman confirmed last night. He showed how hard of hearing people could hear by cupping their ear, and it led to the stethoscope. And I don't have that cone with me right now. But on the civil rights race, I would like to add something. One of the great privileges in my life was to be asked by my candidate, Obama, to introduce him in Philadelphia for the race talk. If there had not been a civil rights movement, if the Martin Luther King hadn't added Gandhi to the dimension of how you struggle, and it finally engaged young people, students, to face dogs and go to jail. And the students led the march from Selma to Montgomery that helped produce the Civil Rights Act of '65. If it hadn't been, on the one hand, large-scale, organized effort to end the two greatest blights on America's standing in the world and on our soul, denying the right to vote because of color and segregation, in 10 years of that struggle, those two central goals were achieved, not just by the civil rights movement. I never was a volunteer for anything except the Army Air Corps, but I was drawn into action for a lot of things, including civil rights, and you could call it service, but it was action. If there had not been the response from government in the two great civil rights acts of '64 and '65, have been one, like, there would have been no clapping. You needed both together. And I think I didn't get to my joke that I was going to begin with until it's your fault, Joel, with your wonderful talk, taking us into history. I wanted to say that it's not Schambra versus Wofford. It's both plus Wofford. I agree with so much of what Bill says about bureaucracy and even expertise. But there has to be large-scale action on so many things right now. My favorite government partnership is the GI Bill. But Roosevelt actually didn't originally support it in the middle of the war. He was concentrating on the war, but veterans fought for it. And it got passed. And it was a social invention that is what some Republicans would like as the voucher principle. The idea that everyone who had served their country ought to have the ability to go to college. And doors should be open to millions of people that before that had not maybe even dreamed of going to college. The GI Bill gave you a voucher that you took to a private college or a public college. You chose the institution and they chose you with no real government intervention in either. It was a truly empowering partnership and a major one. And I yearn for that kind of large-scale action. And there is where we may differ. Though we would, if we go into any such venture, Bill is the kind of person that ought to be on the board or helping to shape it. We have millions of people unemployed today. Roosevelt, who didn't think of public-private partnership, who wanted persistent experimentation. If it doesn't work, we try something else. But it was basically all government action. The effort of recent administrations, and certainly of President Obama, is to do big things on a large scale that need to be done, related to, if he could do it, he would have a big venture in unemployment. Who knows what kind? The Civilian Conservation Corps didn't end the National Depression, but for 3.5 million unemployed men, it ended the Depression for them. And the depression of the spirit of the Great Depression was partly listed by that other large-scale action, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And I would love a GI Bill principle for the nonprofit world that let every American have the chance to have a year of working in a nonprofit program dealing with our biggest problems in just that kind of non-bureaucratic way, unless they went to some of these terrible big foundations.
And I haven't adequately expressed my appreciation for being on the panel with Harris, because he is in fact one of the, if we have to have an organization run by a liberal, Harris is the liberal I want to. I can be on the board, he can run, we'll work out well. But Harris's description of the GI Bill, Harris's, the way he ran AmeriCorps, the community for Corporation for National Community Service, was in fact with full attention to this need to decentralize, to permit the local entity receiving the funds to have maximum flexibility to do what they want and to use the resources as they see fit. And I think that is in fact, I served on the corporation as a conservative Republican with the understanding that that was the character of this particular federal program. Most federal programs are not that way. As you well know, you mentioned vouchers, right, in the neighborhood of Democrats or liberals, and they automatically think you're attacking the public school system, for instance. And if only the public systems were as willing to experiment with vouchers as the GI Bill was, as Harris was at AmeriCorps. Most federal programs are not so structured. They have very rigid understandings of who qualifies. They have very rigid understandings of the amount of reporting and paperwork and all the rest of the bureaucratic nonsense that goes with it. They have not to put too fine a point on it, a great many of them have anti-religious inclinations. They do not permit support for religious institutions. Harris, when he was running AmeriCorps, was extremely generous and was a pioneer in helping federal funds to go to those kinds of organizations. But as I say, that was an exception, that remains an exception. Most of the time you find inner city churches, Pentecostal possibly, some other congregation without the established credentials of Lutheran social services or Catholic social services. They tend to be last in line for getting support from the government of any kind. I'm not one of those conservatives who thinks they should not have that support altogether, because if the support is going out to organizations to do the work, it should go to the ones that are most effective. Those are typically inner city church groups. And you'll hear more about this from Barbara Elliott, I'm sure. Anyway.
We have time for, yes.
Speaking of.
Now that you've raised my name, I'm going to have to ask a question to you. I was going to, actually I do have a question for both of our distinguished panelists. Precisely the issue of federal funding for faith-based groups has been a bit of a challenge. I was involved in the faith-based initiative as well, and one of the conundrums is that the federal dollars cannot fund the faith in faith-based organizations. It can, of course, only fund the secular activities of these organizations, meaning, therefore, the private sector funding must fund the faith in faith-based organizations. The difficulty in encouraging more of them to apply for federal funding has been that federal dollars tend to displace private giving, or if these organizations accept a great deal of federal money, it silences their faith message. I'll call it Eliot's Law. It's a takeoff on Lord Acton. Federal funding tends to secularize. Absolute federal funding secularizes absolutely. So, how then can the private sector of philanthropy be encouraged and educated in order to give more prudently and more generously to the kind of grassroots organizations that are, in fact, uniquely effective in solving certain kinds of social problems that no one else can touch?
I heard most of what you said. I commend you, I recommend that you look at the various programs that have responded, first to President Bush II and then to Obama, on just the points you're saying. Namely, every department now of the federal government has been asked to find ways in which faith-based organizations, especially smaller ones, can be expanded with direct support. I personally favor the voucher principle as the way around the church-state problem for most of the areas where if you support the solving of a problem and you give the individual the opportunity to help do it, which is philanthropy of the giving of time, they can, just as you can with the GI Bill, choose a religious school that you go to for the GI Bill. So I'm a champion of the voucher idea in all kinds of ways. Maybe my last interposition would be to if it's the end, I'd be happy to do it with a line from George Romney. He was called Mr. Volunteer. He was a good, great governor of Michigan. He ran for president. I wish he'd been elected president one day. For 25 years thereafter, he built this infrastructure, as he liked to call it, of volunteering. He believed that unpaid volunteering and full-time national service of the AmeriCorps kind or Peace Corps kind, visitor kind, were the twin engines that could really move the civic sector to solve our great problems. And when he heard I was going to be the new CEO of the Corporation for National Service, he said, I want to come to Washington and see if you can help me deliver what I've tried to get 3 presidents to do, to call of all the presidents and the leaders of the nonprofit sector and local community leaders from around the country, and governors and religious leaders and education leaders, and create some great goals that can galvanize us to solve our major problems. And this is the memorandum he handed me that led to the summit of all the presidents. If we were threatened by external forces, our resurgence would be swift and sure, he wrote, centered around Pearl Harbor, in his mind, of course, centered around a full-scale mobilization of the entire nation. Our domestic problems now demand no less of a response than that same kind, a full-scale mobilization of all our creative resources, from the largest corporation to the smallest neighborhood. There are roles in this for government, business, education, religion, professional, civic organizations, youth, and for each and every American. And I still yearn in my lifetime to see us do it in some new, inventive ways that respond effectively to the warnings that Bill has given, and make this a reality. And so maybe the big difference is if you put me down anywhere, I want a big quantum leap of that kind, led by the President, instigated by the President of the United States in partnership with the other leaders. And Bill Green, he's a romantic too. He believes in little quantum leaps all over this country of individuals and groups on their own initiative, waking up in the morning, angry at what's going on, and themselves setting out to alter it. And I think it's both that we're going to need. And maybe if we just keep talking, we can figure out some ways to suggest. And the center, I hope, will pick up the ball on that question.
Yeah, I just, the difference between the quantum leaps is that I've seen the federal government make a whole bunch of quantum leaps even in my lifetime, and you end up stuck in a ditch someplace. But as Barbara Elliott so eloquently describes in her book, which she'll tell you more about, I'm sure, momentarily, you see those quantum leaps that you just described. The local, particular, the quantum leaps inspired by the Holy Spirit or by some kind of, who knows what power. It's a puzzle to most folks. But somehow or another, those quantum leaps are happening every day. In the toughest neighborhoods in America, people are solving problems, with their own resources, mobilizing themselves to figure out how to do for themselves. And the problem with the big federal quantum leaps is that they end up more often than not squashing those little quantum leaps that are happening every day. So that's why I prefer the local in particular.
One quick one. I warned you that I was going to remind you of the first proposition in the first Federalist paper, which I think would be a good model for any center or university. Hamilton wrote, almost accurately, I'm saying, it seems to have been reserved to the American people to determine the answer to the important question of whether our destiny will have to forever be decided by accident and force, or whether we will find a way to determine our destiny by reflection and choice.
I think that is a marvelous way to bring this panel to a close. I told you at the start we had two great philanthropists here, and I think that has been amply borne out. And it just goes to show that even those who have very different ideologies and basic philosophies can come together around these questions, and so it gives philanthropy its richness and its strength in this country, that we don't approach it as a cookie cutter, that we approach it from different points of view. What I would like to do now is ask you to take a very brief break and be back here as close to 1:45 as you can make it, so that we can get started with our big panel.
Thank you, Bill.